church? Hell no. Are you no longer feeling comfortable in church? This podcast is for individuals who are desperately missing God, but don't know how to find Him. Substance abuse, domestic violence, sex offenses, acrimonious divorce can contribute to discomfort in the church. For these individuals, church is just not an option anymore. Ordained minister Dennis Hall and his guests invite you to listen to this podcast for topics that are inspiring, uplifting, and will bring hope to those who just feel church is not relevant in their lives today.
Hello, I'm Dr. Dennis Hall, and we're delighted that you're listening to our podcast today. You know, I have to ask you, did you happen to notice in the news that the New York City Mayor, Zoran Mondani, has called on the federal government to arrest the Israeli Prime Minister as a war criminal? Should Prime Minister Netanyahu attend the United Nations General Assembly in September? You know, at first he was acting like he and his New York City administration was going to attempt to arrest the prime minister. However, they have no authority to do that. And apparently someone explained that to him. You know, this statement really signals how the New York City Mayor Mondami's administration is in support of Palestinian rights. You know, his insistence that the U.S. federal government arrest Netanyahu was met with condemnation literally all over the world and ridicule from pro-Israeli officials. You know, sadly, Americans' view of Israel and Prime Minister Netanyahu have turned negative. And surveys tell us that 60% of the U.S. adults have an unfavorable view of Israel. And as we sort of look at the Democrats, 8 in 10 Democrats and Democratic-leaning independents currently have an unfavorable view of Israel. 8 in 10, 80%. And multiple recent surveys reveal deep internal divides among American Jews regarding Israel. You know, for instance, 86% of U.S. Jews describe themselves as generally pro-Israel, but only 23% say they support the Israeli government policies. And then among Jews who describe themselves as religious, 60% say that Israel did not commit genocide in the Palestinian war. On the other hand, 21% of the secular Jews, non-religious Jews, say the war was justified. Only 21%. And the same surveys reveal that Jews review New York City Mayor Mondani, who is openly pro-Palestinian, more favorable than the Prime Minister of Israel, apparently reflecting dissatisfaction with Israel's leadership over recent years. You know, the Anti-Defamation League and the Jewish Federations of North America, they report that the majority of Jewish Americans have experienced some form of anti-Semitism in the past year. Nearly 1 in 5 Jewish Americans were either the victim of an assault, experienced threat of physical attack, or experienced verbal harassment due to their Jewish identity. And then in the surveys, it was determined that over a third of Jewish Americans witnessed actual or threatened anti-Semitic violence. And when researchers expanded their definitions of anti-Semitism to include incidents involving being physical attacked or having someone try to physically attack them, being threatened with violence or being excluded from a group or conversation or activity, are harassed online in online spaces, are having their personal belongings vandalized, are being insulted or stereotyped or called some kind of anti-Semitic slur because of their Jewish identity. When you use this definition, over 40% of the survey respondents said that they have experienced one of these things in the last 12 months. Despite growing criticisms of Israel, this country, Israel, holds critical strategic importance to the United States due to its geographic location, due to its military strength and technological innovation, and Israel's role as a key ally in global security. This country, Israel, is located at the crossroads of Asia, Africa, and Europe, which gives this country a unique vantage point over key maritime routes and air corridors, including its proximity to the Suez Canal, a vital conduit for global trade and energy supplies. Israel borders with Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and Egypt, and because of this location, it creates a unique opportunity to influence regional stability. Israel's military, particularly the Israeli Defense Forces, commonly called the IDF, they are globally recognized for their operational efficiency and their technological sophistication. They proved to be a force to be reckoned with in the Six-Day War in 1967 and the Yom Kippur War in 1973. And their reputation was cemented in a high-profile operation that ended a rescue mission in 1976. Over a long period of time, Israel has been a regional stabilizer, deterring hostile actors and supporting the interest of allies, especially the United States. Israel has provided critical intelligence information to the United States military, especially during the current conflict with Iran. Furthermore, Israel has been able to achieve peace agreements with Israel and Egypt and Jordan, and even develop global relationships with global powers that not only includes the United States, but China and Russia and other European nations. Listen, Israel is the only ally that the United States has in the Middle East. And some people don't seem to realize how important that is. Common sense would tell you that our country should be supporting and defending Israel in ways that make sense just on the basis of their strategic importance to the security of our country. There are many political leaders and media personalities across our country who seem to be anti-Israel, anti-Semitic. And we see this in their rhetoric. And no one has emerged as a greater voice in this anti-Israel, anti-Semitic rhetoric than Tucker Carlson, who was ousted from his top-rated Fox News show in 2023 amid fallout from a defamation lawsuit. A recent study reveals that Tucker Carlson's popular podcast shows have turned more negative regarding Israel and anti-Semitism. Carlson has condemned outright anti-Semitism, but he's also provided an uncritical platform to people who are openly anti-Semitic, including the Holocaust denier and white nationalist Nick Fuentes. And then in a speech, Carlson compared the assassination of conservative activist Charlie Kirk to the killing of Jesus, blaming the latter on people in Jerusalem sitting around eating hummus. And he's also suggested that Jeffrey Epstein was an asset of Israeli intelligence, citing a totally discredited conspiracy theory that Israel somehow had foreknowledge of the September 11, 2001 terror attacks in the U.S. And, since earlier this year, the majority of Tucker Carlson's videos have either mentioned Israel in the title or included some kind of eerie picture of the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. One video featured a sinister-looking Netanyahu alongside the Statue of Liberty going up in flames. Other examples included a clip titled Israel's War on Iran, with a featured image that included Trump and Netanyahu and warned about the great American betrayal. And another video on the looming nuclear war that included a picture of a smirking Netanyahu and missiles firing off all around him. Tucker Carlson, he's repeatedly argued that the war with Iran is being waged strictly on behalf of Israel, not the elimination of the nuclear threat. He called the joint U.S. and Israeli strikes that killed the Iranian supreme leader absolutely disgusting and evil. Earlier this year, Tucker Carlson made headlines. He made headlines after falsely claiming that he was detained at Israel's international airport earlier this year on Wednesday, February 18th. And as this story began to unravel, Carson seemed to double down on his lies, smearing Israel as intolerant and dangerous. The truth is that Tucker Carlson and several staff members flew to Israel's international airport on a private plane. And Carson and his business partner stepped out long enough to pose for a photo, which Carson posted on X with the caption, "Greetings from Israel." And then the entire entourage went back inside. They were there solely to record an interview with U.S. Ambassador Mike Huckabee, which, in fact, it was Carson that insisted on conducting the interview inside the terminal. Carson's, he told international publications that he and his staff were detained after the interview, and that people who identified themselves as airport security took their passports, hauled the executive producer into a side room, and then demanded to know what they had said to Ambassador Huckabee. Carson's story was quickly proved to be a total fabrication. Israeli officials never detained Carson, and the room his producer was allegedly hauled to was a VIP lounge. The U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem confirmed that Carson's group, now listen to this, the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem confirmed that Carson's group received the same passport control questions that countless other visitors to Israel, including Huckabee and other diplomats, receive as part of the normal entry and exit procedures. Despite being totally debunked, these accusations still seem to circulate and add false credibility to Carson's portrayal of Israel. And earlier this year, on February 4th, Carson broadcast an explosive interview with the Anglican Archbishop of Israel, who is a known Hamas apologist. Carson titled the episode, "The Shocking Reality of the Treatment of Christians in the Holy Land Funded by the U.S." This video was filled with innuendo and outright falsehoods, painting a totally inaccurate picture of both Jewish and Christian belief. In the video, he and his guests falsely asserted that Jews, not radical Islamists, are responsible for the declining presence of Christians in the region and have made life less welcoming for Christians in Israel. Carlson portrayed Israel's Christians as being persecuted and impoverished. The truth is, in fact, that Israel's small Christian population is well established and among the country's most educated and economically successful communities. Carson also falsely claimed that Israel bombed the hospital in Gaza in 2023, when in fact what really happened was a misfired rocket launched by the terrorist group Hamas had struck the hospital. He alleged that Israeli Jews set fire to the Tabay church near Ramallah, when the fire was actually set by local Arab Muslims. Throughout the video, Carson depicts Jews as a sadistic race and that American Christian Zionists as dupes, manipulated by sinister Jewish interests, while he consistently glosses over Arab terrorism and violence. I got to just tell you, as a theologian who has studied the history of the Jewish people, this kind of attack on the Jewish nation has been going on since the first century. In a December 2025 interview with the American conservative publication, Carson continued his themes that Jews impose their will on non-Jews. When polls show that, many conservative Americans consider radical Islam, that's what Americans consider radical Islam the greatest threat facing this country. Carson just misses that and falsely has claimed that no one in the U.S. has been killed by radical Islam in 24 years. That's just not true. He then argued that persuading to convince, he said, white Americans to fear Islam is something coming from Israel. He called American Jewish Zionists Israel's informal employees in the United States and suggested that the supporters of Jews in Israel have a brain virus. Well, meanwhile, Carson goes on, he dismisses the very real threats against Jews here in the United States. As I was talking earlier, the recent FBI data shows that American Jews are the largest target of religiously motivated hate crimes in our country, and the second most targeted group overall behind Black Americans. Yet Carlson claims without any proof to support it that white people are the main victims of discrimination in the United States, not Jews. Carson routinely ignores Arab terrorism and the ongoing threats against the Jewish state Israel. He depicts Israel as the sole aggressor in the Middle East. This just creates a distorted picture, portraying the Jews in Israel as facing no genuine threats and trying to eliminate any sympathy for them is just some kind of manipulation. When Carlson invites Holocaust deniers and revisionists and neo-Nazis and other extremists. He's providing a platform for hate. That's what he's doing. He may try to deny that, but, and it's hate directed at Jews in Israel. This is provocation. This is not legitimate inquiry. He's had guests on who claim that Hitler and Stalin were great leaders, and that American Jews are the ones who actually run our country. He had a guest on who argued that Churchill, not Hitler, was the chief villain in World War II, and that the Nazis did not intend to kill Jews. The bottom line is he has given extremists a massive platform to sort of mainstream conspiracy theories. And, in doing so, Carson's making anti-Semitic ideas respectable to many of his listening audience. Now, you would think that Tucker Carlson's this sort of relentless anti-Israel rhetoric would have an impact on his listening audience. And Tucker Carlson is not the only anti-Israel personality out there, but his YouTube channel, which he launched shortly after getting fired by Fox News in 2023, has 5.4 million subscribers. And so, Tucker Carlson is a major influencer on the internet. On October 7th, 2003, a physical war of annihilation was launched against the state of Israel by Hamas terrorists, actively supported by Hezbollah, the Houthis, and the Iranian regime. I want to tell you, there's also a spiritual war underway to delegitimize Israel. It's a war that is being conducted by arguing that the church has replaced Israel in God's plan, in God's plan for the world. And Tucker Carlson has become part of this attack that is known as replacement theory, supersessionism, or fulfillment theology, all which teach that the promises made to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph are now fulfilled only through those who follow Jesus Christ, since they alone are designated the true children of Abraham and Sarah. Tucker Carlson last fall declared that any Christian who believes that God has a sovereign plan and a special love for Israel and the Jewish people is following Christian heresy and has been seized by this brain virus. Earlier this year, in February, Tucker Carlson released an interview that he conducted with the U.S. ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee. Sadly, Carlson riddled Huckabee with a barrage of just traditional anti-Jewish conspiracy theories. And to Huckabee's credit, he responded graciously and in good faith with counter-arguments and corrections. At some point along the way, Carlson asked about the biblical borders of Israel, saying to Huckabee, "You tell me as a theologian if I'm getting this wrong, but from the Euphrates to the Nile, I think that's right, and that would include basically the entire Middle East. So that would be Israel, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, but also big parts of Saudi Arabia or Egypt, basically the entire Middle East. So God gave the land to his people, the Jews, or he didn't. You're saying he did. What does that mean? Does Israel have a right to that land?" And then Huckabee responded, "Yeah, you're saying that's the original deed." Huckabee said it would be fine if they took it all up, but I don't think that's what we're talking about here today. They don't want to take it over. They're not asking to take it over. Now, I got to tell you something. Unfortunately, Huckabee's response was inadequate at best, and it angered several Arab states who demanded a retraction from the U.S. State Department, suggesting that comments like that inflame and stir up national emotions. The question is, what does the Bible really say about the borders of Israel? When you begin to compare all of the biblical passages that draw boundaries around the promised land, it's enlightening. God promises Abraham a huge portion of land. All coveted eastern Mediterranean seaboard land. You can read about this in Genesis 15, 18 through 21. Historically, the people of Israel never occupied the full extent of this territory or even possessed sovereignty over it. One way to look at it is that it sort of represented Abraham's ideal borders. The Lord described the boundaries from the river of Egypt as far as the great river, the river of Euphrates. Carson suggested that sounds like most of the Middle East. But it's not. It's not. The river of Egypt that forms the southwest border of the Promised Land is not the Nile. Historical geographers has identified the river of Egypt as the Wadi El Arish, which is a dry riverbed in the Sinai Peninsula that gathers together all the north-flowing wadis in the area and empties into the Mediterranean Sea. And the great river, the river Euphrates, refers to only a short stretch of the Euphrates that doglegs through Syria. That section of river serves as a northeast border of the expansive, idealized dimensions of the land in Genesis 15, and makes no mention of boundaries on the west or east because the sea and the desert limit the land use. Similar descriptions of these borders appear in Exodus 23 and Deuteronomy 11 and Joshua 1 and Micah 7. These passages indicate a whole swath of the seaboard from the tip of the Red Sea in the south all the way to the Euphrates River in the north. And that's probably what Ambassador Huckabee, a devout evangelical Christian, had in mind. But the Bible has another view. In Numbers 34, it defines a smaller, more tightly defined promised land that does not include Jordan. Joshua 13 reflects the same narrow band of territory described in Numbers 34. And when Ezekiel spells out the borders of the land belonging to Israel's 12 tribes, he follows the narrower definitions of the promised land that were described in Numbers 34. Now, I hope I haven't lost you, because the point I'm trying to make is that God did not promise the Jews the entire Middle East. No. It just appears that Carson was trying to imply that Israel is plotting to take over the entire Middle East, and the Christian Zionists like Huckabee are supporting the effort. This is the kind of paranoia that captures and haunts the Muslim Middle East and inspires jihad against the Jews. It's just the type of rhetoric that Israel haters use to depict Israel as some kind of illegal Zionist entity. It's just crazy. And listen, it's just crazy for Carson and others to suggest that there's some scheme to take over the world or the rest of the Middle East, for that matter. There's no scheme. There's no secret plot to annex Iraq or Iran or Egypt or Jordan or even Syria. This whole spiritual attack on Israel is just not biblically sound. The New Testament emphatically states that God has a deep and abiding love for Israel and the Jewish people. The angel Gabriel, remember? He declared, "Do not be afraid, Mary. You will conceive in your womb and bear a son, and you will name him Jesus. He will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High. And the Lord God will give him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over the house of Jacob forever, and his kingdom will have no end." Luke 1:30 through 33. And then in Matthew 15:24, it tells us that Jesus was sent to bring the Father's love and mercy to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And he commanded his disciples to do the same in Matthew 10:6. Jesus taught for 40 days about the coming of the kingdom, and the disciples asked, "Lord, is it at this time you are restoring the kingdom to Israel?" That's what the disciples asked. Is it at this time, Lord, that you are restoring the kingdom to Israel? Acts 1:6. At this point, Jesus could have looked at his disciples with just exasperation and said, "Seriously? Why don't you understand? I'm done with the Jewish people, and I'm replacing Israel with the church." That's not what he said. No, that's not what he said. "It is not for you to know the times or epochs which the Father has fixed by his own authority, but you will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you shall be my witnesses both in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and even to the remotest parts of the earth." Acts 1:7 through 8. And then the Apostle Paul, he explicitly rejects this replacement theology. In Romans 11:1 and 2, he wrote, "I say then, God has not rejected his people, has he? May it never be. For I am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham, of the tribe of Benjamin. God has not rejected his people who he foreknew." This is the words out of these words are out of the mouth and pen of the Apostle Paul. Now look, it may be fashionable for some Christians to attack the Jewish people and say God has replaced Israel with the church. But it's just not true. It's an argument that is steeped in the very arrogance that the Scripture warns against. The rebirth of Israel in 1948 and the ongoing return of the Jews to the Promised Land are among the greatest miracles in human history. Now, as this podcast begins to come to a close, I just want to emphatically say that there is nothing in the Scripture that indicates that the covenants that God made with the Jewish people in the Old Testament have been replaced in any way, shape, or form. This is why Christian Zionists are rejoicing that Israel exists, and not only existing but thriving in their ancient homeland. Every one of us should be fighting against anti-Semitism here in America and around the world. Now, having said that, let me just say we should also be doing everything we can to demonstrate our love and compassion toward Israel's neighbors, including the Palestinians who've been traumatized by this recent war. We don't have to agree with everything done by the Israeli government. However, they are an important, critical ally of the United States and continue to be God's chosen people. The God of Abraham has not given up on the Jews, And he's not given up on you and me. Sinners. Sinners we all are, redeemed by grace alone. You know, when it comes to modern Israel, we should persist in unfailing love as as did the God of Hosea for his adulterous people, and as did the father of the prodigal son. I want to thank you for listening to me today, and I hope you'll join us again on future podcasts. May God bless you.